Hello again. It's wonderful to be back here at Sotheby's. This time, I'm here to introduce the summer season, a whole plethora of events, exhibitions and sales running from old master to modern and contemporary, with a special emphasis this year on portraiture. I'll be discussing some of the highlights, and they really are highlights, with the experts at Sotheby's. There's a remarkable collection of portraits on show from the great collections at Chatsworth House, including work by Rembrandt, Sir Joshua Reynolds, and a wonderful group of Lucian Freuds. The emphasis on portraiture has been very much inspired by the scheduled reopening this year, much long awaited, of the National Portrait Gallery here in London. There are also portraits by the likes of Francis Bacon and indeed Andy Warhol, and all of these works have been gathered together just for this season. So to begin with, here to talk with me about two of the highlights from the contemporary sale is Emma Baker. And Emma, I'd like to begin with this rather remarkable painting by Cy Twombly, 1970.
Yeah,
one of the Blackboard paintings, a rare thing.
Really rare, but also very iconic as well. He started this series in 1968, working between Rome and New York. And they have this incredible energy to them and the cursive script, which has become so iconic of Cy Twombly's work.
These great sort of looping curls that seem to become more and more manic
They do.
the lower he goes down the canvas. Now,
Exactly.
What do you think he was looking at to inspire him? I've always imagined, because he's got a studio in New York, he's got a studio in Rome. He could be looking at New York graffiti. He could be looking at some picturesque old peeling plaster wall in Rome.
Absolutely.
What do you think?
It's a real mixture, I think, for Twombly, and he's this great master of looking back through time, looking back through art history, and picking up on things that are very contemporary, but also very historic. So you have the sense that he's looking at abstract expressionism, minimalism, all these artists that are very of the now in the late 1960s, 70s in New York. But also he's incredibly inspired by ancient Rome, the High Renaissance, and that's definitely something you see in this particular painting, I think.
He strikes me as an unusual artist in the sense that he really does straddle Europe and America. I mean, he's got the studio in New York and the studio in Rome, which is symbolic of that. Mm-hmm. And is he looking at Jasper Johns, the grey paintings? But could he also be looking at Leonardo da Vinci's
100%.
Deluge drawing?
Absolutely, and I think that's what's amazing about these works. And I think for this painting specifically, the use of red chalk does make you think of Leonardo's drawings, makes you think of Renaissance cartoons, and the deluges, the way that Leonardo obsessively returned to this translation of sublime nature is something that Twombly picks up on and is inspired by, that obsessional repetition, and you see it in the rows of loops, in the colours that he's using, and even in the scumbled background, which looks like a deluge in itself.
So modern American abstraction with a Renaissance twist.
Absolutely.
An artist who he spans 2,000 miles, but also, in a sense, 2,000 years.
100%, yeah.
Great. Now, the other work that we're going to look at, which is actually with us here, hanging behind us, which is wonderful to see, is Frank Auerbach's Mornington Crescent, actually made just a year before the Twombly, and like the Twombly, is inspired by a modern urban fabric, namely that of London.
Exactly. It's amazing how you have someone like Twombly responding to the pace of New York, the feel of it, the contemporary art that was happening there. And also, on the other side of the pond, you have Frank Auerbach responding to his very small, dedicated area of North London where he lived and worked and has done for the last half a century. And in these pictures, you really see his dedication to this sense of place. And it almost becomes a psychological entity in itself, very much like his portrayal of the sitters that come to his studio week in, week out, for decades, and he observes them. He does the same thing with his landscapes and the areas around Mornington Crescent, Primrose Hill, Camden, Chalk Farm. But it is these works of Mornington Crescent, I think, in the 1960s, where you see this real confidence emerge in Auerbach's work. The colour is just incredible. and the application of paint is so forceful that it's just that there really are wonderful works.
They are. I mean, I've always felt that he's depicting the energy of the city as much as what the city actually looks like, the appearance of the city. You know, it's the idea of the city as something that's ceaselessly rising, changing. It's a city that's always a building site.
Yeah, it's kind of like a living, breathing entity, and you get that here with the very sort of vein-like marks, the pools of red. It has an organic quality, like the pulsating heart of a city.
I like that. I think that's really true. I think that's another aspect of it, because of the way in which he uses the paint straight out of the tube and uses it so thick. There's a great sensuality about these images, almost baroque sense of equivalence between the city and a body.
Yeah, totally.
And I think Auerbach's always been very conscious of London as a city that has been scarred by events. Scarred by the war. His teacher, David Bomberg, did these amazing drawings of London during the Blitz, at the height of the Blitz, showing St. Paul's, as if to say, it's survived, the city's survived. And some of the energy, some of the rhythm, some of the almost handwriting of those works by Bomberg, I think survives in a painting like this, even though it's 25 years later.
Definitely, and then you see the real contrast in Auerbach's work from the mid-1950s, his landscapes of London, which are about post-war sort of wreckage and post-war fallout. In the 1960s, you see the colour and like optimism and like a real growth towards this rebuilding and recovering from the scars of war, which is very, very apparent in the amazing colour that you see here in this picture.
I absolutely agree. It's sort of almost, trauma has been left behind, and now there's this sense of optimism and growth and energy and power. These really have become, in my mind, they've become some of the classic paintings of British art of the 20th century.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you, Emma, and do if you can, come to see the pre-sale exhibition, because this painting's, it's worth it just to see this picture on its own. Now we're going to look at one of the real highlights of the face-to-face sale, the sale of portraits, and it's a work by Lucian Freud, who in fact was a close friend of Frank Auerbach, and here to talk about his remarkable nice interior is Tom.
Hi, Andrew.
This is a wonderful picture to have, isn't it?
It really is, and I think we're incredibly privileged to be able to showcase this extraordinary painting. I think it's hard to think of any other artist more commonly associated with the portrait in the last 100 years than Lucian Freud, and this is a prime example of a naked portrait, so synonymous with his entire work.
It's an extremely unconventional portrait. If it is merely a portrait, perhaps it's a portrait and lots of other things besides.
Well, exactly. Obviously, it's this beautiful reclining nude in his studio. It feels very autobiographical. The studio was him. His sitters were there for a long time, hours upon hours each day, and could go on for a year or so. So this picture really is a summation of everything that encompasses Lucian's work, and I think it is an extraordinary example of his entire output. The sitter in this portrait is Penelope Cuthbertson, and she is the sitter of about 7 paintings that he executed from 1966 to 1970. This is the finale, as it were. I think for any portrait artist, especially Lucian, that synergy, that relationship with the sitter, that ease is so important.
I think one of the things I love about the picture is the way in which the relationship between the setting and the person seems so organic and suggestive. There's a sense of the nighttime outside in that wonderful dragged paint that depicts these darkened windows. There's the reflection of a light bulb that almost looks like a fried egg. There's the cupboard, it's got Lucian's overcoat and shoes in it. It's almost as if the room and the person are all bound into one image of existence.
Yeah, it's this sort of vortex, and everything is surrounding the sitter, but, it's all-encompassing. Everything for Lucian was a portrait. He said famously, everything is a portrait.
Even a chair.
Even a chair, exactly. And I think, you reference that sort of the open closet on the left-hand side of the composition. You see his coat and his boots dangling, that sort of reference of himself within the painting beside her. It's really fascinating, and as you say, it's all-encompassing, and I think that's what makes this painting so special. Quite often with Lucian, you see more close-up portraits of sitters, but this has an extra element which puts himself, his life, his sitters all at one into this very beautifully executed painting.
It's unusual for me as well, as in the sense that often in Freud, particularly later, you have a sense of sitting being really a vulnerable thing to do to him.
Yeah.
Whereas in this picture, I feel as though she's almost being looked after by him. She's like this, almost like a sleeping baby in the studio. There's something very, very tender about this picture.
It's very, as you say, it's very tender. She feels comfortable in the environment. As you say, it's a darkened window outside. There's a palpable tension with the environment, but she is at ease. And I think that's what you see with a lot of Freud's paintings. They are naked portraits, but it's very much the sitter has control. They control the pose. He wasn't didactic in ordering his sitters where to sit and how to pose. It was about being at ease. And I think part of the reasons why he's so successful at communicating the essence of his sitters is because he took a long time painting. They felt at ease, relaxed in the environment, and it's that connection that happens over time.
Yeah, you certainly have that sense of captured time, preserved forever in the picture. It's a beautiful and a rare thing.
It is indeed.
So moving on to some works of modern art, all of which are going to be sold on the same evening. Now, Thomas, I hope we could start with this rather remarkable picture by Munch, a portrait of Carl Jensen Hjell, if I've got the pronunciation right.
Yes, it's a portrait of a painter, a friend of Munch's, who actually the story of the commissioning is rather wonderful because Munch's just returned from Paris. He went on a fact-finding mission to Paris to look at modern painting, and he wants to take on something ambitious. And Hjell wants a portrait, but the problem is materials. Materials are very expensive.
And it's a big picture he wants.
He wants a full-length portrait. So a deal is struck. Hjell will pay for all the materials and a dinner at the cafe of the Grand Hotel in exchange for his portrait. So
Munch, no doubt, thinks this is fantastic. Gets all his materials paid for and a slap-up meal. We probably now think, gosh, that was a very, very good price indeed. But what a thing that emerges from this deal. I mean, this rather amazing picture of a man who's almost like a spectre of sort of modern bohemian life, staring at us quizzically with the monocle in his eye. I mean, he's really something.
It goes to the heart of what he's interested in, the spirit, the soul of the painter, and his own personal experience. And we get quite a lot of Hjell's character in this picture, far more so than you might do in a more studied, more formal portrait. And this comes down to both the style, but also the casualness of the posture, the way that the light catches the monocle and the lit cigar gives it immediacy and a real presence of the man.
And looking at the picture, it just strikes me it's such a moment in Munch's personal history. He's just taken on board this huge revolution that's gone on in Paris, and he's brought that revolution in his head, and he's applied it to this painting. And I don't know that they'd ever seen a painting like that, so informal. It must have really been something, to the contemporaries who first saw it.
It was a great surprise. I mean, people were shocked by the informality of the pose, but the grandeur of the composition, the fact that he paints a portrait of a painter, not a great statesman on this scale, but with such vivacity, the liveliness of the brushwork, the intensity of the colours and the tones, but at the same time, the informality of his sitter.
I love the insouciance of the pose and the sort of the truculent glimmer in the monocle. It's as if he's challenging us. You don't think I'm important enough for a full-length portrait? It's got all of that sort of youthful vigour about it.
Exactly, still with his lit cigar.
How wonderful. Now, to move on, you've also got another portrait, if I can call it that. It's sculpture. It's halfway between pure sculpture and portraiture, but it's Giacometti's depiction from 1951 of his brother Diego in a roll-neck jumper.
Yes, I mean, Diego, probably his most sort of long-suffering sitter, is the male portrait of choice for Giacometti. He sculpts him from the very, very earliest days of his artistic youth right to the very end. And Diego was employed not only as a model, but he was a master technician, a sculptor in his own right, but someone who carefully applied the patinas to his brother's works and prepared works in process in the studio. So he's an integral part of his art, both as subject and manufacturer.
It's got that wonderful sort of gnarled quality, which I always perhaps this is just me, but I imagine that Giacometti's studio was perpetually wreathed in cigarette smoke from unfiltered gauloises, I believe it was. And you almost feel that you can sort of sense the way in which the image of the brother that he's sculpting is somehow seen through this miasma of smoke, which then becomes a kind of metaphor for the existential uncertainty of knowing any other human being, which is, of course, Giacometti's great subject.
There is a sense with Giacometti, certainly I always think that we have to remember him as both sculptor and painter, that the way he illustrates the world, the way that he fashions it, is in this extremely sort of darting, questioning way that he goes back and forth, tweaking and adjusting at every single stage, the form itself. And so there is this amazing sort of vacillation or flickering quality, even to something which is cast in bronze. This particular cast has been elevated to a true sort of symbiosis of painting and sculpture, because on top of the patina is oil paint. Giacometti has actually applied his own colours to the surface, which helps to bring to life the very surface itself.
And moving forward to another cast sculpture, but very different, however, from not that dissimilar period of history, this rather remarkable piece by Barbara Hepworth.
Her Elegy No. 3. I mean, it is one of the great works. It's monumental in scale. It has an ambition which hitherto we very rarely see with Barbara, because at that time she's making a transition from working purely with carved material to envisaging works in bronze. This broadens her reach, but also the scale of her works, the monumentality. And to some extent, it's because she's inspired by the vastness of the landscape of Cornwall which surrounds her. And this work very, very closely references that. In particular, there's this most wonderful aqueous bluey green on the interior of the form, which echoes the colour and light as it plays on the Atlantic. But on the outside is the scale of the Cornish landscape itself.
It reminds me of some of those remarkable structures that you see cut out of the sides of cliffs by the sea in Cornwall, these sort of almost sculpture made by the elements. And I wonder if she's sort of thinking of that kind of natural equivalence, or whether that's me being too literal.
I think, she certainly referenced the natural world throughout her life, and definitely comments on it as being a key source of inspiration. But I think she sought the essential form, something that could be both evocative of landscape, but also of the human state, the human condition. And the ovoid form was the thing that she struck upon and developed into a universal form.
Yeah, so between figuration and abstraction. And moving towards abstraction, something quite unlike anything we've discussed so far, this rather remarkable, not huge, but certainly portentous oil painting by Kandinsky, in which it seems to me that we really can feel him moving towards that great break from figuration. He's still depicting a snow-filled landscape, but everything's about to change.
Well, he was setting the scene. I mean, it's 1908, so it's right at the very dawn of the 20th century, and it is before abstraction finds its first and earliest form in either Kandinsky's work or in Paris through Cubism. But we do see that glimpse, and it's that transition from naturalistically described landscape to one which is filled with the vividness of colour and an expression of atmosphere. And that's something that Kandinsky does in this, as you say, quite jewel-like format so beautifully colours and the almost the temperature of the snow is beautifully evoked, and there's not even a single white, in this. This is what's extraordinary. We've got a snow landscape, but everything is vivid purples, pinks, blues, even a turquoise employed.
I think of him more, in this immediately pre-abstract phase of his life. I think of him more as a painter of spring and summer. Not so much as a painter of winter. Is this an unusual painting?
It's quite rare, yeah. I think we know that he went to Erfield in the winter of 1908, and there are 2 pictures supposed to have been done in the small village there, quite close to where he's living during the summer months in Murnau. But he's still travelling between Munich and Murnau at that time. And so the winter landscapes are very, very rare, and this is an extraordinary example of them.
Energy, vibrancy, life. Well, do come, if you can, to see the exhibition before the sale itself, which I believe is on the 27th of June. So now to 2 of the top highlights from the now evening auction. And with me to discuss them is Hayley. First of all, I'd like to ask you about this remarkable, extraordinary piece by Mark Bradford, a painting that looks like a map.
It does, yes. So this painting is called Stand Down, Soldier from 2018, and it's part of a very small series Bradford executed based on an earlier installation he did for the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis. And so much of Bradford's abstract painting is concerned with social structures in America, issues of race, issues of class. So this is an abstraction that's very sort of grounded in real life, and an abstraction that sort of moves away from the purity of minimalism of the 1960s. His earlier abstract practice looks to Agnes Martin, for example, but over the course of his career, his abstraction becomes much more complex, and we see this grid sort of break down and dematerialize. And his abstract paintings become very cartographic. They become sort of images of maps of Los Angeles. And he would often just walk around the city and scrape these merchant posters and advertisement billboards off of buildings and off of the streets of LA. And he would apply these papers onto canvas and then scrape them away. So he's using found material, this very gritty debris from his home city, and sort of using this as his medium, and in doing so subverting the lofty grand tradition of painting, really. He's not using oil or acrylic.
So a work of art that looks like an abstraction but is actually very, very much the opposite. It's very much about the real world, and it's
social abstraction.
It's social abstraction, and it's making us think about the nature of social reality.
Exactly.
Now, to move something very, very different, George Condo, what's it called, this picture?
Harlequin's Diary.
Harlequin's Diary.
2009.
And it's kind of a group portrait, is that right?
It is. It's a group portrait of 6 figures. There are 2 nudes that sort of take the center stage of the portrait. But the most interesting aspect of this portrait is the figure of the Harlequin, who has been rendered throughout the history of art. And we think of Picasso's Harlequins, of course. The way that Picasso sort of flattened the figure of the Harlequin in a very sort of one-dimensional way. And we see this Cubist influence on the surface of this painting as well.
It seems very much like a love affair between George Condo and Picasso, this one. I mean, I think of George Condo as somebody who sort of appetitively devours the whole history of art and regurgitates it in the form of his own style, which is full of caricatures, parodies, satires.
Yeah.
But in this case, he seems to be particularly homing in on the ghost of Picasso.
Absolutely. And he actually read Gertrude Stein's volume about Picasso when he was a student. He really fell in love with Picasso's work. But Condo's really pushing Picasso's Cubism further, and he calls it psychological Cubism. So he's looking much more at the very kaleidoscopic number of emotions that humans feel. He's so interested in human consciousness, and he wants to depict not only the external person in a portrait, but he wants to also depict the internal feelings and mental states of a person as well. So while there are 6 figures here, it may be one figure showing multiple different emotions.
Right, so it's Cubism within Cubism, wheels within wheels. Kaleidoscope within a
A
kaleidoscope.
kaleidoscope within a kaleidoscope.
Well, thank you so much, Hayley, for
Thank
sharing
you,
that.
Andrew. Thank you.
So, last but definitely not least, two of the highlights from the Old Master Sale, which takes place on the 5th of July. And here with me to discuss them is Georgina. Now, Georgina, I'd love to start with this amazing, rare portrait of Henry VIII's last queen, the one who survived, Catherine Parr.
It is rare, as you say, because it's one of only two surviving contemporary portraits of her. The other one is in the National Portrait Gallery. So it's very, very unusual to see it. And in fact, it was previously thought to have been destroyed by fire. So it's even more exciting to have it on the walls of our galleries.
And she's such an important person. I mean, she's can, I think, be credited with at least part of the intellectual formation of Elizabeth I. Catherine was a great intellectual, a scholar, the master of several languages. And she seems to have given that, that ambition to be a learned lady to the great Queen Elizabeth.
Absolutely. I think her personality is being completely redefined. And she was an intellectual and a scholar, and she was also responsible for reconciling both Mary and Elizabeth with Henry. And so they were restored to the line of succession. So her influence on English history is really, really significant.
I mean, she's painted as this strong woman who's clearly got a very strong sense of her own worth. Her jewellery alone seems to be speaking volumes about her.
Well, the jewellery is actually a really important part of this portrait, and is part of the reason why we know that it is Catherine Parr, because in the past it was actually mistaken for a portrait of Lady Jane Grey. It's this brooch that she's wearing on her bodice, which means we know that it's Catherine Parr, because that exact brooch is described in royal inventories of her jewellery. And the artist has clearly gone to a lot of trouble to depict it as accurately as possible, even down to the number of diamonds that make up the crown on top of it. There are 15 described in this inventory, and you can count them up. There are 15 there. We think it was probably painted in the very last year of her life, so after Henry had died.
So in the past, the picture's been attributed to Holbein, and it's been considered to be of the wrong person, but we now know it's definitely of Catherine, and we think it's by a rather mysterious painter called Master John, who... What do we know about him?
Well, we don't know very much at all. I mean, it's really not surprising at this period not to know about these artists, because the idea of an artist in their own right as an individual was still not a notion that was really recognised. They were more like craftsmen, really. So signatures and documentary evidence is very, very scarce. There is a reference to a painter called Master John in a list of expenses for Mary I when she was still a princess, and various other portraits have been grouped around this name. But really, I think there was a lot of artistic exchange going on between all sorts of artists at this time.
Well, she certainly had a life, and there it is, preserved forever in this remarkable painting. Well, thank you. And the other picture is this remarkable depiction of Pentecost, circa 1490, again by a rather obscure painter known only as the master of the Baroncelli portraits. But what a wonderful thing it is.
It's an astonishing painting. It's really a painting that deserves to be in a museum, and actually it has been on loan for the last 10 years at the Groningen Museum in Bruges.
So the subject is Mary, and she's surrounded by her apostles, and it's at that moment when the Holy Spirit, the dove of the Holy Spirit, descends, and they are all miraculously endowed with the gift of being able to speak every language under the sun, so that the word of God can be spread to all corners. And it's just got this wonderful sense of a miracle, and yet within it are embedded some portraits of what must be the people who commissioned the painting.
Yes, so the patron himself and his wife are included in the scene as if they're
sort of
there
these
witnessing
black-garbed bookends. Exactly.
And the apostles themselves look quite sort of alarmed and surprised, as well they might, with the Holy Spirit in the form of a dove.
Yes, goodness me, I didn't know I could speak Chinese.
Exactly. So yes, it was clearly an important subject for whoever
commissioned it.
Well, I think, to me it's fascinating because I know that it was part of there was a massive upsurge in the creation of these lay confraternities, rich people getting together and putting their money to the service of bringing the word of God to poor people here, there, preaching. So I imagine that some of the apostles, who seem to me to have very much the look of the bloke next door, are probably actually members of this confraternity, and I suspect that the husband and wife were patrons of this confraternity, and that it actually represents a real group of real people.
Yeah, there's a huge degree of characterization there, but also it's made so relevant because this episode, which should be set in the Holy Land, is actually set in a lovely Netherlandish interior with a huge stone fireplace and floor tiles, and through the windows you can see these wonderful details of Flemish houses and couples walking and people on horseback and a windmill. And it's only changed hands 3 times in the last 400 years, which in itself is astonishing, but it also means that the painting has been preserved in amazing condition.
It's absolutely fresh as a daisy. And I personally don't care that it's not by one of the named artists of the Flemish Renaissance, because for me it's got that sort of perfect genuineness, and it's executed at a totally high level of technical excellence. But above all, it's got this urgency of something that was made for this group of people because they really wanted it, they really believed it, and you can feel the faith. You could almost feel it coming off the surface of the picture. It's just a wonderful thing. So do please come and see it at the preview for the Old Master Cell, because and indeed the portrait of Catherine Parr, because these are wonderful things. The summer season sales run from the end of June to the middle of July. Do check the Sotheby's website for details of the sale you're interested in. And I do hope you can come to some of the previews to see the works in question in the flesh. Thank you for joining me, and see you again soon.